and this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone.
Hello, everybody, and welcome
to the show. Today, we're going to talk about keeping it simple as a player. Now, when you're doing that, it's important to note what is actually complicating the game for you. That's the first step to keeping it simple, because if you don't know what is making things complicated for you, then it can be really easy to say, oh, just keep it simple. But honestly, you're not keeping the right thing simple. You don't know what needs to be made simple for you. So the very first step, the very most important thing that we have for you in this video is to identify what is intuitive for you in the game you're playing, what is complex for you, and what is bogging things down. Now, you might not know. You might just be feeling overwhelmed or realizing that there's just too much, and you might not immediately be able to tell, oh, yes, that's definitely because of spell preparation.
Yeah, or that's definitely because the process of leveling up is complicated for me.
That's right.
But I would say that if you are in a situation where you know that things are feeling complicated, but you're not sure what about it is feeling complicated, I'd recommend talking to other folks at your table and seeing what they notice.
They might already have seen, be like, yeah, I've noticed it. It doesn't happen right away, but it seems like you get like a faraway look in your face, like when it comes to spell preparation, or when the GM is like, okay, we leveled up. Time to pick your feats, or anything like that. They might already know. And if they don't, you can ask people to look out for you, and you can then proactively try to investigate and be like, okay, I am now realizing that I'm going to be trying to help keep things simple and make things not get complicated. I want to look. And when I feel a little bit overwhelmed, I want to think back. What were we doing?
Yeah.
Now, in a lot of cases, you can tell what is feeling frustrating, what is feeling complicated. In the tabletop RPGs, depending on which game you're playing, they have different levels of complexity in different places. Generally, in order to provide depth of play where your play experience feels different and you have a lot of different options, it's necessary for game designers to include complexity into games. And there's a lot of games that are fairly complicated. Even Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, which is simpler than some other Dungeons & Dragons editions, is still more complicated than a lot of story-based indie games, for example. And certainly Pathfinder 2nd edition can be more complicated as well. It depends, though. Even though it has a reputation for being more complicated than D&D 5e overall, for some players it's less complicated, and for some players it's more complicated, and it depends on what bogs you down. Are you bogged down by needing to suddenly improvise things? Are you bogged down by needing to reference and look things up? What you do is you figure out what's going on, and then you identify a path to simplifying the process for you.
So one of the strategies that can definitely help with simplifying is creating references for yourself for the things that you find complicated or confusing that you can then take a look at later. So maybe, for example, things are getting bogged down because you can never remember how your abilities work and you always have to look them up. And you're like, oh wait, which page was that on, and what do I need to look that up as a keyword or whatever. But if you keep with your character sheet, hey, here's the list of how this thing works that I always have to look up, then you won't have to keep doing that.
And if you're not sure, it's relatively simple to do this, which is for one session, if you know lookups are your issue, every time you have to look something up, write it down. Or if it's something you already had to look up that session, put a tally mark next to it. Then at the end of the session, take a look at what you had to look up, what had tally marks, and make reference cards or reference sheets specifically for anything that has multiple tally marks, even something that has no additional tally marks that you're just like, yeah, I know this one's rough, and I may have only looked it up once that time, but I'm probably going to have to look it up a lot.
Yeah.
So you can use basically empirical evidence to tell which things you needed to look up. And eventually, If you look it up on your sheet, you don't need to keep putting tally marks because you have a sheet.
Yeah.
Eventually, you might have everything that you usually need on your sheet, on your reference sheet, and that'll make it a lot easier for you. For instance, I found that demo games are much easier if you have little reference cards for things that otherwise somebody would have needed to look up.
And that can be, things can be complicated for you for a wide variety of reasons. As in, if you're like a really experienced player, it might be like, oh gosh, this is the thing that works differently in this game system than it does in other game systems, and I have it all confused in my head, and I'm not sure, how does it work in this game system, so having it just there could be useful. Or it could be something that's like, oh gosh, in this rulebook, the ways that this work is split between 3 different sections that cross-reference each other, and it's hard to make it work because I have to look it up and then I have to consider this thing. Whereas you just have it like all written out in one place. It's like, okay, this is how this thing works. This has the answers I'm looking for. I don't need to go digging every time. And you can also include things like house rules in that too, so you don't have to go digging and be like, wait, how does this thing work again?
That's right. So another way to help you keep things simpler is to try to simplify a space of nearly infinite options down to a smaller number of choices. For instance, let's say that what you are having trouble with is preparing your spells as a prepared spellcaster. That can actually take a long time. One thing you can do that we mentioned in previous episodes is make a few preset lists for specific circumstances, and then either just only pick from those or pick from those with slight obvious tweaks. Like if you have a blaster list and you're like, okay, but we are going to the fire volcano of the fire giants, so I'll take fireball off my blaster list and replace it with something else.
But that's much faster than having to reconstruct a list every time. And sure, you might not have the world's most optimal spell preparation by doing that, but it's worth it to save the time of needing to go in and figure it out every time. And you're going to have... And you can then, instead of thinking, hey, I need to reconstruct things from scratch, if stuff isn't working as well, you can think, I haven't cast that spell in a while. Maybe I'll take that off of my default list. But then you're not having to be like, wait, I remember it every single time.
That's right. So another big tip for you is when you found what is overcomplicated for you, get help. And the help can come from a lot of different places. Maybe you feel awkward getting help from other people in your group. Obviously, other people in your group know your circumstances the best. So the GM or other players might be able to help you. But maybe the book has something that can help you with this. So for example, let's say building your character and choosing your feats and your subclasses, your class paths and things like that is what trips you up, because you don't want to make a mistake and do something so anti-synergistic that it's just not going to help the team. So the book might have a sample build. The Pathfinder 2 books have generally sample builds for classes. They're fairly simple. They don't have everything, but they're a good starting point. You can also ask the players and GM. Chances are, even though you find this complicated, there may be somebody who has like 350 characters on Path Builder and just knows everything in that regard, who would be so excited and happy to help you do that.
And then you can be like, hey, I want to play a character that is an archer who's focused on trying to do crowd control with their arrows in some way. And then, if broadly speaking, I want to do this kind of thing.
And then you can tell the person who builds all of the characters, hey, give me 3 ideas, just 3 for what to do, and give me a pitch as to why each of those is cool, and I'll pick one of those. They don't have to pick everything for you. They can narrow it down, because often reducing complexity and simplifying things is going from a giant space down to a smaller space. Just like we've often talked about in GM tip videos for how you kind of can get things to be less overwhelming for your players in an open game.
There may also be online build guides for for your game where people are like, oh, here's the guide for building an effective blank. And then
if the game doesn't have it or doesn't have enough, if you don't want to ask your group, or maybe they're not experts in that either. Maybe you don't have the person with 350 Path Builder characters, not someone in your group. Online build guide can be a very sort of low communication cost way for someone who maybe is a little shy or doesn't want to impose to get information more easily and sort of at your own pace.
Another thing that you might be able to find is if pre-generated characters exist for that system, then taking one of those
and customizing
it as a starting point.
We recently did an episode on pre-generated characters that you can check out, and it talks about that from the GM's perspective, but it's useful from the player's perspective too.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Path Builder, and that's another excellent tool, is to look at what kinds of resources are available for automating certain parts of the process that are more, that it could be more challenging.
Although sometimes those tools like Path Builder can be what sort of starts the problem.
Yeah.
Not because they're not great. They are great, and they help you build your character. But because if you had just been building from the core rulebook, maybe because you're a new player or you're just one who doesn't like to get overwhelmed, you'd be like, oh, yeah, okay, my fighter, I only have a few choices here. Oh, I'm a human, so there's like 3 feats that I can take for my ancestry feat. But then you go into Path Builder and it's like, wait, there's these 6 weird Fey ones from Impossible Lands that any ancestry can take, and those are on your list, and and wait, now there's 50 things you could take. And it's like, what?
Yeah. So I would say that for simplicity, I would recommend make some of the choices using like sort of like a more narrow band, but you can use that to remind you, hey, these are the choices I need to make. Here's a list of the decisions I need to make, and this does the math.
Absolutely.
And make sure that I don't forget any of the stuff.
Also, if the math,
the
math might be one of the things that complicate for you. Like maybe not for our chat right now, which has all the people with math in their name or Dave in their name. But if math is what is complicated for you, then tools like Foundry Virtual Tabletop or whatever your favorite virtual tabletop is that does some of the math for you can be really, really helpful.
And Foundry also would remind you, like, hey, this is what you... I see this blank space here for, like, Bard feat, level this. So it's like, okay, yeah, I need to click here and pick a Bard feat.
Absolutely. So, we talked a lot about mechanical things, but the truth is, there's some players, maybe you are the person who has 200 characters in Path Builder. Maybe you are someone who is just like, remembering all the feats, that's not what is getting things complicated for me. I can do that. I can remember the rules, but... sometimes it's keeping track of all the role play and all the names of these NPCs because their GM has thrown so many of them at us and the plots and schemes that are going on in the story and my character and what my character thinks and would do as opposed to just kind of playing myself in this situation. Maybe that's what's complicated for you.
So one thing that I would recommend that's worked well for my gaming group and that I am often the one to... maintain is like a list of active story hooks.
Yes.
So like, and the thing is that you probably want whichever player in your group is like the one who's good at managing one particular thing to probably be like the one who's managing that thing. But it'll be like, okay, anytime that someone says, hey, why don't we go check out this and we don't do it yet? Or like, oh, like the GM said something and it's like, oh, that's obviously a hint towards something. Then you can throw it on the list of active story hooks. Then you start a session and it's been 2 months and you're like, what were we doing? And then we're like, oh, yeah, active story hook says, that here's the things we were thinking about maybe pursuing. And then the group, instead of being like, what are you going to do? Pick a thing out of nowhere. You can be like, well, our list has 4 things. Which of these things do you think we should do?
Exactly. Once again, it takes this almost infinite idea space and narrows it down. Here's a tip for if, like, keeping track of role-playing your character is one of the things that's being complicated for you. The same thing we said for the mechanics. So you can get out some, like, little note cards or some other reference doc. Note cards are kind of nice for this. Where you put down a few key things that were important for role-playing your character. Like maybe you need to get revenge against the evil Lucian who killed your family, and your character is outwardly cold but secretly compassionate, and your character loves fancy outfits. And those are things that you want to talk about with your... I mean, they can change over time.
Yeah.
Your character can adapt.
And then you can change your reference.
You can put out little note cards for all 3 of those things in front of you. And then also maybe, like, flip them over when your character in that session has been able to express that thing. And then that way if they're still face up, it's like, oh, Even though these three are really important for my character, and maybe it's okay.
Yeah, because not everything is come up every
Lucian,
session.
the evil villain, doesn't come up every session, or like ability to wear fancy clothes. But if you have been able to do it, you can be like, yeah, see, I was able to do something that showed how much I like fancy clothes, or that I'm secretly compassionate, even though I'm outwardly cold. Mm-hmm. And that way, it's sort of like a checklist for you that you can pay attention to. And if you're consistently not doing any of those things and kind of just maybe playing yourself, or even that the character has moved on, you can remove that card and just be like, well, I guess that's not important for that character anymore. Because
what's something else that could be important?
I didn't do anything with fancy clothes for 10 sessions. I was just covered in mud and I didn't care. Maybe the character at this point has been able to like move through that and has evolved, and something else is important. So even when you don't use them, those cards can help you feel like you are able to keep track of your character and their personality.
Yeah. And for NPCs, having a list where it's like, NPC name, key thing about them.
Exactly. You can have those on index cards, or just a sheet, or some kind of spreadsheet, or whatever is the best way to organize them for you, you can do. And if the GM wants to play ball with that, they could even provide you, if there's like art of the NPC that exists, that you could put like an art on the note card and be like, hey, look, here's the NPC's art and their name, and this is what we know about them. It's like, they're a friendly shopkeeper. They always give us good discounts. And Bob is suspicious that they're secretly evil and trying to manipulate us.
So one thing about making these references is that, like, if you're deep into a campaign, then it can be a lot of work to go in and put all of these things in there. So first of all, things are generally easier when you start at the beginning and then you build them up than when you are trying to like go in and clean everything up. So if you can set one of these systems in place early on, then that helps. And if you can't, then start with the things that are most important. Like, it doesn't necessarily matter as much if you're like, oh yeah, we're level 17, and back when we were level 2, we met like the shopkeeper or whatever. But you can think of like, okay,
if that's like the recurring shopkeeper, and they have art in the adventure, and Bob is suspicious that they're secretly manipulating the group because they keep sending them on quests, and they're a major character.
So then you can be, whenever there's someone who comes up and you're like, wait, this person was important, who are they again? Then you can be like, okay, let's make a reference for like that character.
It's basically, once you forget them, once they become something that's bogging you down or complicating, that can be when you decide to make the reference. The same as when you had to look something up in the book and you made a rules card for that. When you realized it was something you needed to look up.
So I would say that, like, one of the strategies is, like, when you notice something's being complicated, try to address it sooner rather than later. So,
or
like,
at least write it down at the time, and then you may not have to address it right then because you're playing. But then you can address it.
Like, it doesn't have to be like in that session, but like before the next session usually is good. Another thing that happens with this, like, for example, if your group finds inventory and treasure to be complicated, and the way that they respond to that is, oh, let's just not look at it for 3 levels. And then they're like, oh, gosh.
Yeah. Whereas treasure and inventory was exactly the thing I was thinking of next, because of the fact that it combines the in-character roleplay stuff with the out-of-character mechanical stuff, because it is something that both the characters in character and you, the player, needs to keep track of.
I find that, it usually is more natural to have one player who kind of takes point on the management of inventory. Then when a treasure is gained, they'll write it down, or they'll be the one responsible for checking with the GM after the fact to make sure that everything's in there.
If there are multiple people who have to keep track of things themselves, you can have an issue where an item gets duplicated or destroyed due to the fact that one person thought that they had it, but the other person doesn't erase it, or that one person thought they gave it over and erased it, but the other person didn't receive it, and then it gets lost into the ether.
Yeah, so for that, your group might have a system where it's like they write things down, and at the end of the session they're like, okay, the barbarian gets the great axe, and they figure out the barbarian gets the great axe, and the bard gets the mask, and then like those things are distributed.
So if you really get bogged down by inventory management, one way to handle that is to just not be the person who's handling it, and just be like, just give me what I need. I trust you, inventory person. I'll just take the items that I have. But let's say that just like that's not going to work for your group, where everybody is like that. You can simplify things somewhat, and it's a little sad to me because as a GM I love, and a player I love keeping the weird items that we find and trying to find a use for them, but you can simplify things by just selling everything except for the things you know for sure you're going to use. And that way you have a smaller inventory, so there's less to remember.
And first talking about, like, how Foundry is great for this as well. So, like, unless your GM loses the campaign info and backup, which it sounds like is a specific...
Sounds like that may have specifically happened to them.
But yeah, like, having some kind of other tool that manages that is great, and then you can be like, okay, this is in the party treasure versus this is, like, given to a specific character.
Even then, if there's, like, 50 or 60 things on there, it can bog down for some players. So if you can use the, like, radical selling thing, you know, like, does this spark joy? If not, then get rid of it.
Yeah, well,
mantra.
I think that as the group's inventory manager, like, it makes sense to go through, like, at least every few levels and be like, wait a minute, there's no way that we have so out-leveled this thing, we don't need this anymore. Or, like, everybody already has a blank. We don't need, like, another blank.
Right. If you have someone who's able to go through large lists like that, of course. And if you're not that person, then great. The other person can do it. That's an easy answer. If your group doesn't have someone who can easily go through those large lists at all, which fortunately we have Linda in our group, and she does that, then I would recommend, even though to me as a player...
Doesn't spark as much joy as the next potency.
There you go, yeah. Even though to me as a player it hurts my heart to do this, but I would recommend just auto-selling a lot of things.
Like, if you get it and people are like, does anyone want this? No? Okay, we sell it.
Because at the moment you got it, everyone's thinking about it.
Yeah.
So if you do it then you will never have an inventory that bogs you down completely. And that's how you can deal with it if no one in the group is good at dealing with having, like, 200 things on a list that they have to look through.
Because then, in that case, each player is only responsible for what's specifically in their inventory.
And the shared amount is very small, very key items. Like, oh yeah, that scroll of resurrection we found, that's probably a good one to keep in case somebody dies.
And then you don't have a large amount to sort through when that
Exactly.
you don't have, like, oh, well, at some point we might use this for something. I mean, obviously, if you have players who are like, we must keep all the things, it's different. But if you have a group that's getting bogged down,
if your group are pack rats and also can't handle having large lists of things,
then I'd recommend talking to the GM at that point, because then it's sort of like, well, you might want to be working with a different thing of treasure, where it's like, okay, you know, the GM is specifically dropping treasure items that fit with characters, and maybe it's like, yes, technically this area included the fact that you got 17 great swords and 12 sets of leather armor and all this kind of thing, but maybe the GM is like, all right, you know, you got sell value 250 gold pieces worth of stuff that isn't particularly useful, and then you've got these 3 items that are useful.
And that way the GM is doing the same role. Now, if the group is like, no, we really are packed, we want to keep all of this, you could also talk to the GM and have the GM just drop more value worth of things, knowing that the group is going to have a list of like 200 things they never look at, that they keep because they don't want to get rid of them. And that's going to be like a sunk cost of worthless value that has been dropped. So therefore it's like, yeah, but you know what? The GM's going to drop twice as much treasure as normal. And knowing that the group won't do that. And part of the social contract is that nobody gets the bright idea to go to that pack rat pack after agreeing not to and then selling it all to give the group tons of money. So there's numerous ways to handle this, just like all the other problems that we've talked here about what's overcomplicating your character. So, we've gone into the specifics. Let's bring this back into a general solution.
I actually want to talk about one more thing that I've been seeing in the chat, which is I saw a thing about, like, tactical decisions. Like, someone talked about having, like, coming up with a flow chart for a character for a player who's having trouble deciding what to do with their character, where it's like, you know, a flow chart of tactics for, like, here's ways that I'll use my abilities. And I also saw a mention of, like, you know, even like having a chart of things and, like, some ability to, like, randomly decide if you're stuck and you're just like, oh, I don't know.
That's right. Or like ability cards for your spells or abilities that are just in front of you that you can look at them and be like, oh, this is each of the things that I have. That makes it easier. I mean, I made some for Eldamon, and it made it easier for people who were just completely new to tabletop RPGs to choose their turns. So, absolutely. And this brings us to the generalized form of how to simplify your character if it's getting overcomplicated. So step 1 is identify what is bogging you down. And all throughout this, ask for help if you need it. Then step 2 is to take the very complex or almost infinite idea space and narrow it down to a few things.
This might be something that you do on your own, or it might be something that you get assistance from someone else or an online resource for.
That's right. And this could be by literally selling the objects until you're down to fewer, by making short cheat lists, by putting things in front of you to make it easier to see, by identifying key aspects to roleplay. Whatever the situation is in the game, you can find a way to narrow that idea space down into a few things that you can focus on to make what seems insurmountable and overcomplicated down into a simpler problem by breaking it down into smaller parts.
I would say also, another thing is that within your group, there are going to be people who have different ideas of what's simple and complicated. So if there's a player who thinks that a particular thing, say inventory management, is simple, it's a lot easier for the group as a whole to have that, person who thinks inventory management is straightforward, do inventory management, and person who thinks that character builds are straightforward, help with character building.
So in that sense, volunteer to help with the things that you find simpler when you see someone else is struggling or finding it to be complicated. And if everybody works together, then unless your group has one shared sort of weak point that everybody finds complicated, you'll be able to solve pretty much everything. And even if you do have a shared weak point, you can work together on narrowing that down, as we gave many examples throughout the episode.
And that can be using tools, through talking with the GM. You may even want to work with the GM to create a house rule to make a particular thing that's hard for everyone in the group simpler.
That's right. So, with all that said, hopefully that makes your game simpler. Please like and subscribe, or even join if you want to support us. And let's vote for an episode. Now, actually, wait. Do we need to vote for an episode? Do we not? Aren't we not having an episode next week?
We will not be here next week, so we'd be voting for the week after that.
So, oh yeah, that's right. We have to vote.
We have to vote because we won't be here.
Because we vote for the week after. That's right. The times that we don't vote are when we have one queued up already for some reason.
So it looks like we have 2 votes already for one from Math Guy and David.
Yes. The Dave conspiracy towards building an adventure. So vote for 1 if you want us to build an adventure on the stream. Vote for 2 if you want Save Your Game Q&A. Vote for 3 for a tools episode about what's in a name and naming things. 4, and we'll play some kind of a game on here. And then 5 is other, which you must specify.
And while folks are voting, let's go ahead and give people XP.
That's right.
For watching, our live viewers.
Hope you stayed until the XP. There you go. So we got enough for 1. So build an adventure workshop. Gosh, we're going to do 2 builds in a row because we have an item before that. So if you come on Tuesday, the 4th, this Tuesday, we will build an item in chat based on your ideas and votes. We will not have an episode on the 8th. 11th is jury's out because we're going to vote on the 4th for what's going to be on the 11th. And then on the 15th is when we're going to build an adventure. We got another vote for that.
Fistful of Flowers. I'm a fan of that adventure. I say completely unbiasedly.
Yes. For some reason, Linda is a fan of Fistful of Flowers. I wonder why. All right, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.
So I will say that since these are both concept ones, if you can start thinking of ideas in advance to have them right there at the top, then you are much more likely to get your idea through.
Also, it's just very helpful to us. So think of an item or adventure concept idea you'd like to see. All right.